Good day, good afternoon, dear audience. It's a pleasure to see you again in another episode of the Riga Security Forum podcast. We're happy to meet you for the fifth year in a row. And today we actually have a discussion where we'll be speaking about the most vulnerable parts of society. We'll be speaking about women and children in international conflict contexts. And whereas this topic now has been discussed a lot, NATO and the transatlantic security and democracy community is facing unprecedented threats internationally. We're facing multiple crises in different regions of the world. And it definitely puts us to test, asking the question, can we maintain international peace and security? And can we make sure that women and children and their interests are put at the center of attention and that they merit our efforts? And in order to discuss the topic, I've invited an excellent specialist on the matter, Stéfanie von Hlatky, who is the Canada Research Chair on Women, Peace and Security. She's also a professor of political studies at Queen's University and a fellow at the Center of International and Defense Policy. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Stéfanie.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I also must add that she's the author of a book, Deploying Feminism, the Role of Gender in NATO Military Operations, which was just released in 2022. And it is also based on your fieldwork in Iraq, Kosovo, and the Baltics. And for this reason, I believe it will excellently feed into our discussion. Now, Stéfanie, I want to start with perhaps a reflection. Very often in my own research, I see that in security-related contexts, and especially in conflict, it is indeed the interests of the military, the interests of defending, rather than the interests of human rights that become the winners. What are your own observations from the field as a researcher, as a practitioner?
It's such an important question, and I really don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. The research that I focus on, which looks at the women, peace, and security agenda, is really an attempt to reconcile the two so that our understandings of security and defense are broader and reflect also people's conceptions of security. And so as we look to the United Nations, as we look to NATO, as we look to the European Union, African Union to design operations and international programming in conflict-affected areas, it's important to think about that security through a broader lens so that it's more sustainable and so that we can achieve more peaceful outcomes. So it's really trying to reframe the conversation so that defense and human rights, or a people-centric definition of security, aren't seen as mutually exclusive, but trying to think about security and defense as more holistic, understanding that there are state interests and state-based conceptions of security, but also understanding that designing solutions that will hold over the long term really need to take into account the population.
Indeed, and NATO has done so much in order to integrate the gender perspective in its operations. Here we speak about defense and deterrence and also crisis management and prevention. Perhaps you can speak a little bit about that, because I believe that very often when we speak about NATO, we think about it purely as an actor for security and defense, but it's also an actor for democracy.
No, that's quite right. And it's so timely to have the discussion on NATO and its commitment to women, peace, and security, because during the Vilnius summit, it was stated that the women, peace, and security policy would be updated. So right now, consultations are taking place at NATO so that by the Washington summit, which happens to coincide with the 75th anniversary of NATO, there will be this unveiling of NATO's new women, peace, and security policy. Of course, it's not a new policy, but it's periodically updated. Women, Peace and Security commits NATO to focus on diversity in its own practices. So, in terms of the representation and participation of women within NATO structures, also in terms of the representation and participation of women in its operations, but also commits NATO to think through a gender perspective, as you've just correctly noted. And that encourages all of NATO's community, both civilian and military, to think through the gendered implications of security. So, for instance, when NATO is designing a mission or an operation and focused on operational planning, that it thinks through the differentiated impact of a particular conflict on different segments of the population.
And one of the topics that is definitely going to come to the focus of the Washington summit is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, this is definitely one that reaches the Latvia's headlines on a daily basis. We are all very, very worried about it. However, I don't think we understand enough how conflicts disproportionately affect women and children. It's true that we speak about domestic violence, which is a consequence, but within conflict, there are so many multifaceted threats that women and children face. Maybe you can speak a little bit about what are your reflections on the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the invasion in 2022 has had such dramatic impacts on the population. When you look at the refugee population, for instance, you see that women and children are overrepresented. And of course, this has implications for how the international community or NATO or individual member states can lend their support and design appropriate responses and help in a way that's reflective of the needs of this refugee population. We can also see as well how Russia has normalized conflict-related sexual violence and rape in particular as a tactic of war. And this is affecting both men and women, but differently. So very important to condemn in the strongest terms these acts. And also emphasize just how it's transformed Ukrainian security forces and Ukrainian armed forces. Prior to 2022, women were participating in the Ukrainian armed forces, but there were still some restrictions when it came to certain professions, occupations, and trades. With the invasion in 2022, restricting the participation of women in the security forces and the armed forces more broadly would have represented a security liability. So when there's this ability for mass mobilization, you really need to look to the entire population in terms of who's willing to serve. And that's where you see women's participation dramatically increasing from the front lines to support. So a number of different roles that are played here, which is very important to acknowledge. And so we often see these trends, right? So we see various member states of NATO having removed professional restrictions for the participation of women in their armed forces at different times. And there are different reasons for why that occurred. Sometimes they were court challenges, but sometimes it's also a different assessment of the security environment. And when that threat is increased, or when there is this perception of an existential threat, you have to look to the whole of population for providing that capacity for defense. That's what Ukraine has done, and we've seen it in other contexts as well. When there is an existential threat, all of a sudden the doors swing wide open for women's participation.
Indeed, but this leads me to think that this is also a matter of politics. So somehow gender is brought to the political fora and very often becomes a very polarizing issue. So why do you think that is?
The fact that issues of gender equality and women's rights have been politicized and has become a polarizing topic is unfortunate. And I think it's detrimental to our ability to achieve security and sustainable peace, frankly, in the world. We see that, one of the most robust empirical links we can make is between gender equality and peaceful societies. So how do we ever hope to achieve regional security, global security, if we politicize gender equality as an issue. We have the empirical data to back it up. We see that there's this incredible link between gender equality, women's rights, and security. So we should really build on that in designing security solutions, whether it's a NATO context or a global context or a national context. And so when we just look at that, it's very easy to step away from the politicized debates and to think about how to build in those considerations into the way that we design national and international programming to support peace.
Indeed. And now, when I think about NATO in general as indeed not only a security and defense actor, not only as a strong alliance, which indeed I think has become one of the critical components and certainly is the critical component of Latvian security structure, I also think about it as somehow this setting of an example of how we can collaborate and put our differences aside in order to build a better environment for every player in it.
Yeah.
So do you think that NATO is the poster child internationally for gender equality and integration of the gender perspective, putting on the gender lens, gender glasses when it comes to integration of women on all levels of the chain of command and in all operations? Or is there something that we can do better?
There's always room for improvement, that's for sure. I think that where I'll highlight good practices emerging out of the NATO context, it's how it's institutionalized the women, peace and security agenda. And we have to keep in mind that it's a relatively new agenda in the NATO context. The first policy was adopted in 2007. So in terms of NATO's entire history dating back to 1949, it's a fairly recent development on policies and practices. But the adoption of a policy, the fact that it's been regularly updated, the fact that the military has adapted the policy to its own purposes with a military directive that will be relevant for its missions and operations. The fact that specific positions have been created to support those commitments, from the role of the special representative to the Secretary General on Women, Peace and Security, and the broader office which supports her work, to the gender advisors and the gender focal points, or what NATO refers to as the gender structure across the entire organization, to the mandatory training that is offered for the NATO community, to the funding that's been committed to the agenda. Those are tangible manifestations and evidence of a process of institutionalization, which means that NATO has been able to build on its progress incrementally year after year. So on that front, I think that NATO has set the foundations for the agenda to flourish. That being said, there is organizational resistance at times. There are hurdles and challenges, both in a headquarter context and at the mission level. But when that core foundation is there, at least you can build on that foundation successively as the years go by and continue to update the vision. And that's what we're going to see in 2024, is an updated vision for NATO with some of the lessons learned of past missions and operations, and some of the input of a growing community of member states, because as we know, NATO has continued to welcome some new member states.
Indeed. And this, I think, is what leads me to somehow reflect, because I very often hear, and I want to talk about gender very often with people in security studies and in the military, and then they say, yes, but women can come and they can participate, and we've put in place all these institutions and support for women, and of course we've opened up the military, we really have overcome some prejudice, yet we don't see full participation of women on an equal footing with men. And we came here today to speak about gender roles. So do you think that what we see out in the society and how we are socialized as people also affects, and how does it affect the participation of women in military forces?
No, you're absolutely right. Gender roles in society matter. And they will definitely influence the choices that people make. We have to pay special attention to the women who are in the armed forces and to make sure they are well supported, and to make sure gender integration is an ongoing process and continues to improve. What has been a very important first step is removing some of the formal professional barriers for women in the armed forces. Of course, there are lots of informal barriers. Some might call them cultural barriers, in the fact that military culture was designed initially by men for men. And so as the organization changes with more women in the organization, you're going to see some shifts and some necessary adaptation. And so that's part of, I think, a normal process of change. But at the same time, we have to be very clear-eyed about some of the very real challenges women in the armed forces continue to face despite the removal of these professional barriers, from the way that military installations are fit or not for a gender integrated force, to some of the experiences, including the high rates of sexual violence that you might see in the armed forces. So really paying attention to those things will be really important to move forward in terms of increasing the representation and participation of women in the armed forces.
And now perhaps already looking somehow to the future beyond the Washington summit. So what is it that you think NATO will achieve perhaps in the next 5 years when it comes to gender equality? Because there is more and more need for NATO presence, of course, in Europe. There is more and more demand for security, and all of this has to be put in place within some kind of standard. So what do you think is what we can expect as women, as people who want to contribute to our indivisible and common security?
Thank you. So I think NATO is a great forum and platforms, offers platforms to have these discussions, and that in and of itself is really important. We think of NATO as a very homogenous organization of like-minded democracies, but when we look at the 31 member states, we see that there are a lot of differences too between the different member states, their political culture, the representation and participation of women in both civilian and military institutions. So I think it's important to think of NATO as a place where we can share best practices on the most innovative ways to improve security, including embedding gender equality as a true planning consideration for the way that NATO plans its activities. NATO will continue to face certain constraints as well, because it does rely on member states for the fulfillment of their individual national action plans on women, peace, and security. So I think we need to think of that whole continuum of commitments that member states have made. They've made those commitments at the national level with their national action plans, at a regional level through NATO with the women, peace, and security policy, and of course on a more global level through the UN from Resolution 1325 to the several other resolutions that followed. So there's a layered architecture there of commitments. Member states need to be accountable for the commitments that they made, and then in a NATO context also sharing the experiences that they've had and the policy innovation that they've experienced, so that NATO as a community can continue to grow.
And then I still have one more question, because I want to open up this discussion for further reflection that we can catch up on, you know, in some future formats, because I think NATO, we have this privilege of living in this really safe environment compared to so many regions of the world that face perpetual threat and danger. We have the privilege of living in a society which is democratic and observes the principles of equality, and we can always be critical of the places we live in. However, you know, this is normal. This is what democracies allow us to do. They allow us to discuss. But at the same time, NATO is not isolated from the world, and we see that there's so many different dynamics when it comes to women, peace, and security unfolding. And very often, looking at, you know, different countries that have taken on a national action plan, the commitment to women, peace, and security is seen mostly as, you know, a sign of good faith and a sign of, complying with the international norms formally, but then the application of the National Action Plan is lagging behind. So there's probably a million reasons, but maybe you have some top 3 ideas in mind that you see from your research.
Yeah, no, so I think it's fair, it's a fair point to make, and I think that you'll see times when there is more political enthusiasm for something like the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and sometimes when there's backsliding or even backlash. We talked about the politicization of some of these issues, including the very topic of gender equality. I think that that's when we need to really focus on the role of civil society organizations and women's groups. Resolution 1325 and the creation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda as a UN agenda to start was really spearheaded by women's groups and civil society organizations who wanted to refocus the conversation on the differentiated impacts of conflict on women, men, boys, and girls, recognizing that that was an underappreciated area, to say the least, of how we conceive of security and building peace. So we should never lose sight of that, even though the agenda has been somewhat militarized, has been really the focus of a lot of planning efforts in military operations. The link with and engagement with civil society really needs to be front and center, and that's where, despite the political pendulum swinging, those long-lasting relationships with civil society advocates will allow us to maintain a focus on what those differentiated needs are, and also to empower those groups who have a huge role to play in this more holistic conceptions of security, empower them to move forward in terms of being peace builders wherever they might be in their home country, or on a global level when they're engaging in multinational fora.
Thank you very much for your time and sharing your ideas. And on a personal note, I want to say that it's incredibly inspiring and important for the audience here in Latvia, in the Baltics, and in general in Europe to hear about this, because I really don't think we hear about this enough, even though gender has been a topic of security debates for a while now. And I indeed hope that we continue the discussions in the next year's forum, perhaps in different other formats. Good luck.
Thank you, Elizabete, and I'm happy to be back anytime.
And thank you very much to the audience of the Riga Security Forum. Thank you to all the partners. Thank you to the organizers. And we hope to see you in our next session.